It's great to be here, and I can't imagine a better panel to briskly walk through this question, what's the right energy mix? We've had so many changes in the last few years, it's hard to keep track. If you looked at EIA or Department of Energy reports from 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, or even 3 years ago, they have no real relationship to what's on the ground right now, especially because of natural gas and shale oil, this shale resource that came about largely through innovation, a mix of government-funded and private enterprise and digging and finding out new techniques to get at a resource that wasn't considered really harvestable up until 10 or so years ago, at least at this kind of scale. And now it's really upended things. We'll definitely talk about gas, but we'll talk about the future of coal, obviously. And we'll talk about, which is still the world's biggest, fastest growing source of energy, even with the growth on the other arenas. Coal, in terms of its mass use around the world, is still going gangbusters. And the climate question is there. We'll talk about Obama's speech a couple days ago and his climate action plan, much of which was laying out things that were in the pipeline for a long time, but some of which is a little new. And we'll see how that plays in this question of how do we maintain energy mix that works for the long haul. On my blog, I write about that question. How can we get an energy menu here that works for the long haul? And that is the question. So we'll start with Kristina. And what my initial charge to each panelist is, in considering this question for this century, as we go through the world goes through sort of a peak of population and consumptive appetites, right. You look at the energy menu now, you look at where we would need to go, and what keeps you up at night, either as an opportunity or a problem that you see as not getting addressed adequately. Kristina Johnson was the Undersecretary for Energy at Department of Energy until 2010. But before that, she had established an amazing resume, background in engineering, and was the provost at Johns Hopkins and a senior vice president there, I think, at one point as well. And now she has her own company, Enduring Hydro, which is focusing on how to look at existing hydro resources in the United States and find new ways to harvest more electricity from them. So what keeps you up at night?
A lot. But anyway, first of all, let me just say thank you all for being here, and thank you, Andrew, and Aspen Ideas Festival for this opportunity to talk about what keeps me up at night. I think that I want to go back to something you wrote, actually, Andrew, in the New York Times article about the energy challenge, and you referenced a conversation between Firestone and Edison on Edison's deathbed in 1931.
Firestone, like tires, Firestone.
Yeah, Henry, I think. So there's another quote, and this is what keep me up at night, and it's by Edison, the father of our electrical grid, and it goes, "Sunshine is a form of energy, and the winds and the tides are a manifestation of that energy. Do we use them? Oh no. We burn up wood and coal as renters burn up the front fence for fuel. We live like squatters, not as if we own the property." And I think what keeps me up at night is we need to start living on planet Earth like we own the property. And so when I think about that, and when I was undersecretary, we did what's called a strategic technology energy plan, which is to say if we were to hit the government's goals of 17% greenhouse gas reductions by 2020, 42% by 2030, and 83% by 2050 relative to the 2005 levels, what would it take? And so we laid out a plan and walked it backwards. And in the electrical consumption, it's real simple. It's one plan. It doesn't have to be the plan, but it seems to work. And it's basically a third nuclear, a third renewables, and a third fossil, where half would be with carbon capture and sequestration. So it's a third, a third, a third. It's easy to remember. And I think what keeps me up at night is really the nuclear piece. And I think also the carbon capture and sequestration. We can get there with the renewables. 33% is not a huge lift. If we just keep deploying wind and solar, we do need to still have government policy, investment tax credits or production tax credits. And hydro, we can get there. Right now we're about 12%. So we have to get another 20%. But if we just keep putting, something like 7,000 megawatts a year of wind, 4,000 megawatts of solar, and we do a total of 20,000 megawatts of hydropower by 2035, we can get there, and we have that capability. Nuclear, I'm concerned about. We were just building the first new nuclear power plants in the last 30 years. Thank you. And I think that's a challenge. It's a challenge because I think a lot of people don't understand nuclear power. I'm not an expert, but I do know that the types of plants that were in Fukushima are very fundamentally different than the Gen 3 Plus that we need to build now. So I think that's a real concern. And then how are we going to do carbon capture and sequestration at scale? And if we go after distributed gas where we're not going to do carbon capture and sequestration of the gas plants locally. So we have to have larger plants where we can do it at scale. So other than that, I sleep well.
Yeah. And we'll get back to some of those themes for sure in a couple minutes. So Tom Fanning at Southern Company, Chairman, President, and CEO of a company that in 2001, I've been writing about climate change since 1988, my first long article. So I've tracked since before there was an IPCC, before there was a treaty. And I was glancing through my stories. In 2001, when I was writing about energy companies' response to global warming science, Southern Company was, and I heard this from people even within the energy industry, including other utilities, that it was there's a culture of coal and very resistant to the science. But I think I've seen some signs of change. I don't know whether that was valid at the time. This is 2001. I can Google you the article. But so what is Southern Company about going forward? With this question in mind, what are the urgent priorities that you've got?
So there are urgent priorities. There's a huge opportunity, and I'm really kind of passionate about this. One of the things I start with is this idea of a new normal, and I think that is garbage. This idea that somehow we're going to have slower economic growth and unacceptably high unemployment persisting for a long time now. And I think the energy sector is a way forward for Americans to play offense in a challenged environment and give us an unassailable advantage to create the renaissance of manufacturing in America, create jobs, rise personal incomes, and make American lives better. I really believe we're on the cusp of something that nobody in this room has seen in your lifetime. And why do I believe that? When I think about the natural resources that we have, oil, natural gas, coal, the electrification of the economy, I think we can create something that will have profound impacts. In fact, Citigroup would estimate that we can increase GDP growth by 2 to 3% by 2020. They think that we can create 3.5 million jobs by 2020. We can add $5 trillion of economic value by 2030. Now think about the national deficit. And think about this idea of rejecting unacceptably high unemployment and low economic growth. We can do this. We're the second largest electric utility in America from an energy production standpoint. We're about the size of the nation of Australia, just a little bit smaller. So we're pretty big. We used to be a coal company. Right. And now we're the third largest gas consumer in the United States. And when you hear the idea of all of the above, we've been saying for some time, all the arrows in the quiver. I think that's been Trump now. But we're the only company in America doing it. That is, we are building the first new nuclear units in a generation of Americans. We are building a coal plant, 21st century coal, that has a carbon footprint less than natural gas. And in the process, we're creating more domestic oil through enhanced oil recovery. Pretty cool stuff. The CO2 is not a waste. It has tremendous value. We did 1,200 megawatts of renewables last year. We can talk more about that. Energy efficiency is another one where I think we got to include that in the portfolio. Somehow you need to work that into your third. Yeah. Because energy efficiency, or better said, productivity, is in fact a wonderful negative resource, right? So that's good stuff. Yeah. Anyway, I'll stop it there, and we can go into this thing. One last thing I'll just say, just to be a little controversial right at the outset. Everybody's excited about the panacea of natural gas. We have made this huge shift from 16% natural gas production now to about 46, 47%. So that's where we are. We've made the bet. It is not a panacea. There are 5 reasons why you should be cautious about natural gas, and that's my teaser.
Good, I like that. So I just wrote down 5 reasons, so we'll circle back to them. Lee McIntire, CEO of CH2M, which I learned has a very long and interesting history going back to 1946, that acronym name. Yep. So look it up if you want to know more. But essentially, it's a big company, works around the world.
Yeah. We build stuff.
Yeah, you build stuff. And one thing we'll talk about for sure is systems thinking, or the lack of it in American energy policy. But tell us again, when you look at this, the questions we face in decarbonization and energization of the world, what keeps you up?
Well, the big issue still hasn't gone away. We got population growth, another billion by 2035, another billion now on top of that by 2055, and that could create, all studies say, a shortage of energy around the world. We'll get to the U.S. in a minute, I'm sure, but around the world, a 40% shortage in energy, 40% shortage of food. 40% shortage of water, and they're all three connected. You can't do energy without water, you can't have water without energy, and food needs both. And so that definitely, I'm optimistic because the engineers and scientists of the world will solve a lot of those problems, and there's technological breakthroughs that will help. But that's a big issue. We've got a really crowded planet coming at us. And then you flip to the US, where a lot of good things are going on. You can make very nice predictions, playing on what Kristina and Mr. Fanning have said. You can take very optimistic predictions that over till 2035, we could be self-sufficient. We can maybe talk about the difference between independence and self-sufficiency in a little bit.
Yeah.
But we could be self-sufficient. We could have less carbon imprint than we have now. A lot of good things going on in the US of A or even in North America. But in the world still has that nexus of those four things is issue, and throw in global warming within the nexus of the four. That definitely keeps me up at night. It hasn't gone away because we discovered some gas.
Yeah, to me, I've written about the two prongs of the energy challenge. One is the 2.5 billion people or so who don't have a light to turn on to do their homework or do their work at night. And the kids, I wrote a piece, a scientist from Stanford, she was studying mammals in the Himalayas responding to climate change, but while she was there, she saw this amazing scene where these two families running little tea houses in a Himalayan park had a knife fight over a pile of firewood. And when I see that, that keeps me up at night, just as much as the carbon question.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned science, and also I also heard this learning curve, the idea that scientists could solve our problems. This morning at breakfast, we were talking about your learning curve on you know, that it isn't just solve the problem. Oh, sorry, when I turn my head, you can't hear me? Okay, I'll, at any rate, sorry about that. There's this, you know, what can science do, and then how would you prompt science, how do you facilitate that? How can you facilitate having science do the basic grunt work to give technologists and entrepreneurs the opportunity to build new systems that can become the new normal for energy? And one thing that I've written about for years, since the mid-2000s, is that the bipartisan slumber party we've had in this country for decades on basic investment in the basic sciences that sustain energy advance. So, what's your first name? Oh my God. Eric Isaacs. I blanked. He runs the Argonne National Lab, one of the labs that has a hub, one of Obama's innovation hubs on storage for energy, and has also had a long and solid history in science in these arenas. So, Eric,
what keeps me up at
what
night?
keeps you up?
So first let me start with the big experiment we're doing. So we're putting 30 gigatons of carbon every year into the atmosphere. And that's an experiment we're doing, and it's not one that you can try again and again. It's not a benchtop experiment. It's a real experiment. It keeps me up at night, but that's not the major thing that keeps me up at night. We've heard a discussion about the sort of all of the above, the technologies out there that we know we can innovate, from nuclear energy to solar, and we know we can do all this stuff. And from a technical point of view, even you've said, right? I mean, we have the expertise, we have the bright scientists to really and engineers to put all that together. But the thing that keeps me up at night, seriously, are the 1,000 scientists and engineers that work at Argonne, the hundreds of thousands of scientists and engineers that work across the whole country that don't have a long-term commitment from, let's say, from the country. So when you were talking about my learning curve, right? When I first took my job, I thought science is going to save the world. And I really thought that. I thought that we could easily take that 300 gigatons and make it 5 gigatons and then ultimately make it 0 if we could just move to solar, move to wind, move to nuclear, and we'd be done. And these guys would find a way to capitalize on those things too. It's technology, but it's sort of a known unknown. You know you have to solve the problem, but you know what it is. What we don't have is a commitment to doing that. And so if you go back in time, go back to, of course, everyone likes to talk about NASA in the early 60s and the space shot, and we committed basically 4.4% of our GDP to making that happen, billions of dollars, so 4.4% of our GDP to solving the problem. We had a clear outcome we wanted. We tried to solve the problem. If you talk to my scientists today and ask them, are you committed to this for 30 years? Is this something you think you're going to want to work on? Because it is a 30-year problem. Mm-hmm. The answer is I don't know, because I don't know if the commitment's there. So here, go from science and technology, who I think is critical to solving the problem. That's, you mentioned the hub. I think what we really need to think about is how do we get a global or at least a national commitment to investing in the long term. Otherwise, by the way, all these young kids who we see around here are just, why would you as a kid go into this? Why wouldn't you go into, developing the next app? So,
right.
So that to me is the critical, that's what keeps me up at night.
So Kristina, when you were at DOE, was there anything you saw that relates to this that you want to jump in on? I mean, the stimulus package was great, but when I put this chart on my blog periodically, it's kind of like in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Anyone ever see that movie where everyone has this vision in their head of the same thing? There's this chart of our investment in science as a country over the last 50, since the Cold War and Sputnik. And it just dribbles away. Then you see this little beep, and that's the stimulus, the energy money, and then of course that's history. Yeah. So when you have a cliff like that, how destructive is that to these kinds of initiatives?
Well, I think there are a couple things. One is the policy cliff has been very difficult for particularly wind, solar, and even hydropower. But I might submit that Bill Wolfe, who is president of the National Academy of Engineering, said that engineering is about design under constraint. And so I might suggest that since we have a constraint of 30 or 40 years to fix this problem, that's really an engineering problem. I mean, the science, I think, pretty much is there. I think it's an engineering problem, and engineering not only in the traditional sense of the world of being a problem solver, as you suggested, Eric, with the hub, which I think is a great idea, something that we started through the stimulus. But I also think that what we have to do is be sure that we invest in education, that we invest in the kind of the jobs and the creation. I mean, I think I just read an article about Southern Company and the Vogtle nuclear project that we're shutting down the Savannah River site for processing plutonium because there aren't enough folks who understand manufacturing at a nuclear level, and that you're hiring all of them, which fair dues, but there aren't that many out there, right? So I think it's an engineering problem. I think it's the fact that 50% of our engineering workforce is 50 or older, so they're going to retire in the next decade. How are we replacing them? I have a small startup.
So all of that is this kind of the tail end of the space race, essentially, is that pulse of talent.
But here's the point. So if I were to give you this riveting speech, point number 2 beyond the full portfolio would have been creating as a national priority this space race on energy. Right. Think about how much value we've created through IT innovation, right? IBM and now Apple and Google and Microsoft, all this stuff.
I think we can still do it. I don't think it's too late.
Well, of course.
It's what we ought to do.
Here's the point, though.
Yeah.
It isn't enough to ask government to do, although there is a very appropriate place for government to do, and this is in the research S-curve, R&D S-curve. Government in the very early stages, it should be a primary player, the kind of stuff you're doing.
Right.
Let companies like mine do the commercialization and scale up. Southern Company is the only company today in the electric utility industry that still does proprietary research and development. Everybody else operates through a research co-op, essentially called EPRI, Electric Power Research Institute. And I love EPRI, don't get me wrong. I just hired their CEO to be on our board, and I was a vice chair once, and now the current chair is a Southern Company person. We love EPRI. But it is not edgy enough, punchy enough that proprietary, robust research is.
So I agree with that. So here's the question, right? So instead of complaining about what Congress can't do, I think you're right. We can do these things. That what doesn't exist in my mind, it exists maybe in your company, but not almost anywhere else in the energy business.
But that's right.
Is these ecosystems where you have, it's a manufacturing ecosystem from the very beginning, where you have people innovating the materials that will ultimately become the product of your solar panels, all the way to people who know how to scale. And I think the scale issue is huge. And the thing that scientists don't have, as much as I'm a booster for scientists, is they don't have a sense of what the scale is for energy. It's huge, the scale for energy, right? And if you look at, it's a science point, but if you look at the material scaling factors, there aren't many materials in the world that have been scaled to the scale you need for energy. Right. I mean, there's one that I can think, there's two that I can think of. There's asphalt and there's copper. And other than that, and we're asking this in much more complicated materials, whether it's for biofuels to drop in replacement biofuels or whether it's for new solar cells. So I think the critical solution is we have to partner. We have to get together with the scientists in the labs and industry who can scale things.
Yeah, but I think there's something that's missing there. And I think this is the thing, is that a lot has been talked about the Valley of Death, but what's missing between the scientists and the folks that are commercialize it and take it to scale is understanding the system's process engineering. And this is something that there was a NIST program, which was the Advanced Technology Program, ATP, and they funded small companies to develop the engineering process, because you invent something like a battery we heard about yesterday from Jay Whitaker, right? Now you want to make 1 million of those. It's that process engineering. So a venture capitalist isn't going to fund you unless you've got a customer. A customer isn't going to want you unless you can make 1 million. Right. If you can't figure out that process, that's the Valley of Death, and that's what ATP filled in.
I want Lee to jump in what's going on and not government.
Yeah, I want Lee to jump in here, but
we always talk
on
about
systems
government too much here, I think. Yeah, well, you're right about the systems approach. There's holistic approaches right now. They're going on around the world and through engineering, and they're fabulous. Fabulous things. We're using natural water reserves right now to cool industrial water from power plants. There's a lot going on. Our new marketing approach for looking to where our new markets are is we look at the space shuttle satellite photos, and instead of looking at marketing reports. And basically, I noticed something going on in North Dakota recently, where about a third of the state looks like it's on fire.
Right.
And what's going on there is they're flaring gas, because it's really about oil there. Eventually they'll gather the gas and we'll move it, and there'll be more gas for us. So there's a lot of innovation going on. The tight oil, tight gas thing, even though Tom thinks it's not going to solve all the world problems, it's not, but it's a big element for the U.S., huge element. We could become energy self-sufficient, and I don't like the word independence, because independence means we're not going to sell oil or buy oil. That's not going to happen. We're going to still stay in the market. But self-sufficiency means you make enough oil to equal the amount you use, and then you can trade around the edges, kind of like agriculture in the U.S. So it's very exciting for the U.S., and we have these wonderful neighbors to the north and the south who are also flush with energy, and our neighbor to the north is flush with water. And I would put my last pitch in, well, I'll leave water out of the subject right now as it complicates it, but water is a huge drag factor or a very critical factor on energy going forward. But the U.S. is looking pretty good.
Hey, wait, let me jump in on the scale point real quick.
Okay.
Because scale can be...
I love panels when I don't have to do much. This is
Scale can be develop a widget and then they make a million. That's what you were talking about. Right. The other kind of scale is, and this is one of the things our guys are working on right now, one of the problems you have in a deregulated market, it doesn't work particularly well sometimes. Texas has negatively priced wind at night.
Right.
One of our guys are working on the idea of take negatively priced wind at night. Let's take air, push it underground at scale. Mm-hmm. And so now we're going to use the earth as a battery. Now that's scale. So let's take 1,000 megawatts of wind, push it in compressed air underground, we'll put turbines on top of it, and we'll extract out compressed air energy storage during the peak periods of the day. And now for something that doesn't have capacity value, now it does. You can do pump storage hydro. That's another way to think about
That's
scale.
systems thinking.
But don't you think, I mean, just as an aside, that pump storage, we've got 30,000 megawatts of pump storage. We don't have any operating case systems in the country right now. So why not do pump storage?
We do have a case system. It's in South Alabama.
One.
Yeah, well, but this is the new one we're trying to think about.
But is it operating yet?
No,
Right.
it's
No,
part
I'm
of
saying
research.
That I hear you on that. I just think that we have systems that can do storage at scale right now called pumped hydro. And we should be putting pumped hydro in the Northwest, and we should be doing it in a lot of other places. And we can do that now and it doesn't require research. I'm a little skeptical on case, that's all.
Well,
as you didn't notice.
okay, it's wonderful to be skeptical, but the point of research is to take ideas that are not yet commercial and try and make them work. That's the kind of thing we should be doing.
I know, but if we've been working on it for 30 years and it hasn't worked, then one might think about something that
Then
has
you
worked
should
for
give
50
up.
years. Right.
I don't think so.
So sorry, go ahead. You're the
Well, I do want to. I want to dig a
Are
little bit.
you sure you want to get in on this?
Well, one thing that matters to me a lot is, I mean, hydro and pump storage for wind have value, but there's limits to how much you can grow the hydro in terms of looking at the grand energy landscape of the Earth. Coal is this giga resource that is, you look at what's being dug in China and Australia and the United States.
We're going to be using more coal going
Right,
forward.
so let's
in the
dig it.
world.
So let's spend another 5 minutes on coal, and on I want to find another 30 seconds on your plant that's more efficient than gas, and then let's talk about carbon capture. Do a little reality check on carbon capture.
Super brief. So this is something we developed.
And then we're going to incorporate some questions from the audience.
And I'll be very brief here. I'm going to race through some stuff. In the 70s, we were working on liquefaction. That is taking coal and making it into an oil derivative looking thing, okay? Then we moved into gasification kind of over the decades. And all of a sudden, we hit on something now where we're going to be able to use native Mississippi lignite. This is a low-grade coal. About half the United States coal supply is what they call low-rank coal. What we do is we put it into our technology. For those of you wonks out there, it's a circulating fluidized bed. It's like enormous pipes is what it would look like. It's in a reduced oxygen environment, so we essentially combust it without a flame. It releases a synthesis gas. We have filters that capture the synthesis gas. We remove 65 to 70% of the carbon dioxide. Instead of it being a waste, we use the CO2 in something called enhanced oil recovery, and we produce more domestic oil. So imagine this. In a place in Mississippi desperately in need of economic development, we're using a resource that otherwise goes unused. We produce more domestic oil, more domestic electricity, create jobs, and produce energy. Now, this is a very high capital cost project, but it produces energy. At $90 a barrel of oil is how the CO2 is priced. It's kind of indexed against barrels of oil. At $90 a barrel, the energy is equivalent to about $1.25 per million BTU of natural gas. Way better than natural gas. It looks a little bit like a nuke from an economic standpoint.
I want to get to Steve now, but I want to ask one more question about that, and we'll hold the carbon capture question. Actually, let's go to Steve. So
Eric.
what was your response to that as you were kind of,
To carbon?
Well, it's sort of cleaner coal.
I think it's great. Actually, I think cleaner coal is great, but it's not. I mean, still, we still have China growing at a huge rate, and so it factors of two are very important because I think that we're going to have coal forever, as you said. We're going to have natural gas, maybe not forever, but for at least for 100, 200 years, and so those are all great things. But they're still producing vast amounts of carbon, and I mean, we can quantify it. I mean, we still have this 30 gigaton issue, right? And that's not going away. That's being driven by pressure in China because of all the growth of cities. By 2030 in our own country, 85% of all the power will be consumed in cities, and those cities are going to be producing all that carbon. So I think it's very important. Actually, the one question I was going to ask before I start talking about capture is that's a great technology to export to China because China's not building plants
We're
at
doing
this
it.
level.
We're building a plant in Dongguan, China.
Okay, great, because China's actually building plants that aren't so clean, and so to see that kind of thing, and they're building one a week, so this is a really good thing. Let me just
wait. Interestingly, you know what they're using our technology for is not to produce more electricity, but to displace imported gas.
Yeah.
Lee, I see something in your face.
Well, coal's a totally interesting subject. I mean, right now, Germany's importing we're producing the same amount of coal as we did 5 years ago,
Right.
but we're not using as much. We're just shipping the rest of it to China and Germany, basically, which is interesting. So Germany shuts down nuke plants, or starts to shut them down. It's going to take a while. In fact, they may never get it quite done, but they're going to shut it down, so they're buying more coal. They're chasing renewables and coal. That's an interesting story in itself when you think about coal pollutes more than all the other subjects we've talked about, certainly more than hydro and nuclear and gas. So it's an issue in the world, but the world's going to need 35 to 40% more energy by 2035 than we got right now. Where's it going to come from? Part of it's going to be nuclear. A lot of the world, not us so much, but the world is producing nuclear. It's going to be renewables. People are going after renewables. There'll be a lot more gas because there's going to be tight oil and gas in other parts of the world. And it's going to be coal, big coal. Therein lies
and unfortunately, a lot of that coal,
the scary issue.
And a lot of
That's
that
a scary
coal
issue.
is not American coal. Go to southern rim of Australia, it's brown coal.
Right.
And that's what China's buying and building through Rio Tinto. That stuff is, well, right? You don't want to burn that stuff.
I lived for a year in Melbourne, Australia, trying to buy the Loy Yang B plants, brown coal. So.
Yeah, I've written a couple stories about, Australia had a lot of good press when the government that was in power passed a carbon restriction and price domestically, but they conveniently excluded all that coal, that's the carbon they're exporting to China in their calculation of their success. So it's a small amount compared to their overall footprint, but there's a lot of this. If you don't look at the grand system,
Right.
and the climate system doesn't care where those emissions are coming from, and they accumulate CO2, carbon dioxide.
We haven't thought in a systems way in this country up until recently, like Tom's plant, a few other things. Those are systems sort of thinking.
Right.
Or yesterday, Roger was talking about maybe on the nuclear side, you're going to have to get multiple utilities to kind of go in together and think about it and tie it together with hydro and wind. And systems thinking is just sort of emerging.
Well, we're not
Well, it seems kind of un-American, actually. When
It is.
We're not about that. In the New York region, for decades, I've been writing about reports that come from the Regional Planning Association, RPA, and they're really grand, ambitious reports about systems thinking for the New York region economically, and they never get followed because we're all competing with each other. So that creates a really wicked situation.
Yeah.
And this gets at what you were saying, and actually you've all been saying about the limits of science alone, without some way. The National Renewable Energy Labs came out with this really wonderful report saying the United States could go 80% renewable by 2050, but they had this language in there, this big disclaimer that said this excludes economic, social, and political factors. Okay, so like, hello, does that have any
So let me
meaning at all?
address that if I may. Because one of the things that we did with our Strategic Technology Energy Plan, which the first step is energy efficiency, to your point. So we consume about 100 quadrillion BTUs a year in this country. What we want to do is make sure out in 2050, we're still just looking at 100 quads. So that means we have to have an energy reduction plan, and energy efficiency is a part of that. But we then had BCG come in, and Boston Consulting Group did an analysis of what would it cost in order to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions according to the third plan. So if you want to get to 85% or 80% clean electricity by 2035, it's $700 billion between now and 2035. That's $30 billion a year. That's one single shot grande latte per household per week.
But as you were saying, but a third of that is nuclear. That's completely putative.
Can we talk about that
No,
third,
let's
third,
let me
third?
finish.
That
No, let me finish.
third thing.
That-
Okay.
Go ahead
Well,
and
let me
finish.
finish. That includes building nuclear power plants. That
Right.
includes carbon capture and sequestration. Includes gas. Here's what is the difficulty, though,
Yeah.
because it's the savings in energy efficiency, and by doing so, the 5 points. I have 5 points too. Quickly, energy efficiency, decarbonize the electric sector, electrify the light-duty vehicle fleet, fuel switching for heavy duty to biofuels, and then modernizing the grid, which could mean micro and mini grids as well as our centralized grid.
Yeah.
All right, so we costed all that. And it's only a net of $700 billion. We'll spend $2.7 trillion in our energy infrastructure between now and 2035. It is 0.23% of our gross domestic product,
Yeah.
which is half of what we spent from 1956 to 1980 in our highway interstate massive national project, where we spent 0.46% of our gross domestic product. We can do this. We need the policy. And when you think about a system, we need the policy and the systems thinking at that level,
This
not just
tripartite
science.
strategy, we keep talking about nuclear 1/3, renewables 1/3, and fossil fuel 1/3. I've got $1,000 says we won't hit that. There's no way we can build enough nuclear plants to get to 1/3.
We're
The
at 20%
renewables,
now.
even if we grow at 50%
Yeah, but many of
a
those
year,
are
the
aging.
reason for it is the elephant in the room, gas. We have just found a way to extract a lot of gas, and it's very cheap. It's going to get cheaper. The price might not be cheaper, but the
Yeah.
production will get cheaper. That is going to make it very difficult to grow nuclear at a super rate,
Sure.
and it's going to put backward pressure on renewables.
I just want
because we've been.
I just
Go
want to
ahead.
inject one other. I don't think it's just that simple a calculation, because the resistance to nuclear is much deeper than that, and it's about
Absolutely.
cultural. You know, we were
Absolutely.
living off the.
Hang on.
We're
In the
living off the
Southeast,
shadow of
people
3
love
Mile Island.
nuclear.
Yeah,
Sorry?
we love you.
Yeah,
we love you.
the
We
Southeast,
love
I
what you're
guarantee
doing.
you, it is economic development,
Yeah, there
you
it
go.
is jobs,
Absolutely.
tax base,
And it's
it
no
is the
carbon
cleanest.
electricity.
I agree. As an
Absolutely.
engineer, here's what an engineer would do. We would circle LA with nuclear power plants to move water around, because 18% of California's energy is spent to move water around in a place where there's no water. So an engineering solution would be all about nuclear. There's no
Yeah,
doubt about it,
but-
but engineers don't run the world.
Hey, you
No,
want
I
to do
know. This is
economic
the issue.
stimulus? Let's build nuclear plants.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I know.
No,
Oh, there you
exactly.
go.
Here,
Well,
let me give you one more
so
thing.
let me ask you a
though.
question. So
Let
how
me,
come-
let me give one more thing, just to underline
Yeah.
something he said, because here's our portfolio. We're 16% nuclear. We can swing natural gas and coal. Natural gas right now, 45, 47%, coal 35%. And then renewables and hydro are just kind of a small amount, like 4% right now. And we're kind of more hydro.
Steve,
we're
you-
adding
yeah.
new nukes. It's
Yep.
only going to preserve that 16%.
That's
right.
That's
right.
Because the pie is
Right.
growing. One last
Right.
comment real
So
quick.
how does the
Hang on,
nuclear
hang on.
pie grow,
Yep.
though? How's the nuclear
Well,
pie grow?
you got to keep building.
There's
Hang on.
104 of
You
them.
need
We
low
should
carbon
not
guarantees.
take as an objective function, use less energy. Here's my point. 48% of the families we serve in the Southeast make less than $40,000 a year. Those families want to live in a better place, they want to eat better, they want to educate their kids better, they want better medical care. As you raise the human standard of living, you will necessarily use more energy. So here's what I say about that. Use less energy where you can.
Sure.
Use more energy where you should. And if that involves improving somebody's standard of life, let's be all for that.
Yeah, it's
Well, I
energy
agree, and
intensity
especially at the
carbon
global
intensity.
scale. When you take
Yeah.
that to the global scale, it's even more true.
Exactly.
There are places in the world where the people should have access to any kind of energy now because it's better than what they have now. Steve, I want to go to the audience, but you
Eric.
seem to have, oh my God, I know someone named Steve Isaacs. Sorry, that's why. And then we're going to go
I want
to
to
the
correct it
audience.
for the record, so.
Yes.
Yeah.
So did you have some point?
Well, it's a couple things, actually. So many things have come up. But,
Are the microphone
but, you know,
runners ready?
one of the things that makes the U.S. great is this debate we're having, right? We're all over the map. And the question
But it's an all of the above problem.
It's an all of the above problem, and we all agree that we have to do all these numbers of things. But I think one of the problems we have, and we all share, is that we can ask for everyone to raise their hands and tell us what they think the right mix is, right, or what they think the right way forward is. I think we do a terrible job on a single message. I know DOE tries to do this a little bit, right? But I think one of the things we really have a problem with is, if you want nuclear, right? People have a reaction to nuclear. It's very, you don't want to do social engineering on the other one hand, but on the other hand, we, scientists included, do a terrible job. Look at the whole climate change debacle. That was all because scientists got out ahead of themselves. Scientists were doing what they should have been doing, which was reporting on things and making statements on it. But then the newspapers got a hold of it and they made their point on it, right? And I think one of the questions you could ask actually is how do you get a clean message? In France, it's a very clean message for energy. I mean, that's why France is, 70% nuclear, 85% nuclear. It's just a clean message. It's,
But you know, they have half the amount of nuclear that we have in our country.
just
to be clear, 54 plants.
Germany,
are about
interestingly enough, Germany is got their tongue in their cheek when they say no nuclear.
Right.
But they have a very clear strategy. You may like it, you may not like it. No nuclear is their strategy. It's crap because they're buying all their nuclear from France. But they have a very clean argument. They're electrons, right? They have nuclear electrons, but they just happen not to be made in Germany. We don't have that message at all. And you could ask for a show of hands in here how many people know what the U.S. strategy is for energy, and we don't have it. And I think that's a shame.
Hey, let me give you one more thing. So EPRI, if you want to go look at something, Google something. They called it PRISM 2.0. And what that did was regionalize a clean portfolio by the United States. So the Southeast has a different portfolio than the Desert Southwest and the Midwest and the Northeast. That's a way to think about, at least as a framework, what is kind of the best portfolio in order to achieve a number of objectives. And let me just tell you, the objective is not just clean. My responsibility to the families we serve is clean, safe, reliable, and affordable. We have to have a lens that balances all of those functions.
So let me just come back to
Yeah,
this one
one
point
more
one more
second.
time. This morning we
we
were listening to Senator George Mitchell, and great orator, and he basically said the following thing. He said, the U.S. only responds in three situations. One is where there's consensus. Okay, there isn't consensus around energy. One is where there's a crisis. And one of the things that, of course, natural gas kind of brings us out of the crisis in some way. And the third is if you have great leadership. And the question I would ask is, certainly we don't have a crisis. I mean, some of us may argue we do. We've got 30 gigatons of carbon, et cetera. But it's hard to argue with natural gas we have a crisis. We don't have consensus about a path forward. So the question is, do we have leadership? And I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, President Obama did try to step up earlier in the week to give that leadership, but I think we have a real problem because we don't have one of those three things to make this whole thing
Well,
move.
one of the issues here, again, getting to that wedge of investment that happened after Sputnik, it was based on it was the Cold War, was the proxy for going to the moon, and all of that stuff was framed around a true crisis where everyone had a salience, people voted on, thought about, did their exercises when they went down into the basement for the 6 alarm bells at my elementary school. It was existential, and I don't think you'll ever get that with climate change because of the nature of the beast. I've written about this again for decades.
That was fabricated, but so that
Which
the fear,
part? Oh, the fear of nuclear
in
Armageddon.
many ways, dropping rocks from the sky.
No, I know. Well, that'll be another session maybe next year. So, audience questions, and are there microphones? There are microphones for you guys. So, where are the microphone people? All right, I need this guy right here in the front, and then we'll take one in the back,
All right, Bob.
and then over there. You'll be third.
I believe,
Hey,
Wait
Bob.
for the mic.
my name is Bob Potter, and I believe that the issue of the distribution of energy is not the important point. That the important technology that's missing in electricity and energy is the storage of electricity. And forgive me, Kristina and Tom have heard me make this case before, and they are trying to store electricity with water or air, but we need portable storage. And the answer to Eric's question is an all-out national program to find out a new way to store electricity for portable applications that requires a major effort of the military-industrial complex,
Yeah, okay.
like putting a man on the moon and returning him safely, and that gives your man 30 years
Well,
or 20
talk
years.
about the hubs.
So,
Okay, good. Thank you.
We actually
Or
have
Manhattan.
but I agree with two things you said. One is you need a pull. You really need a strong pull, and the military happens to be one of those pulls. So hopefully one day is the automobile industry, EV everywhere. We actually did recently form at Argonne, but 14 institutions, an effort, a really big effort, well, big by our standards, $125 million, to focus on exactly the thing you're talking about, which is lighter weight, high density, low cost, safe, and fairly inexpensive storage for...
$5 billion, not $100 million.
We're not going to,
Hey,
well,
real
I won't
quick,
get
too,
there,
There's
but-
a commercial pull too. Distributed generation is one of the exciting potentials in the future,
So-
right?
so-
My area of the United States.
Right, so and I agree with that. In fact, a good friend of mine, his name is Michael Polsky. He runs this company called Invenergy, a wind company. And he will tell me, he's on my board, and he's hounding the hell out of me. He said, if you just give me a battery and I can store 10 to 50 megawatts, then we're done. And this is something that,
Well, you can do that now, right?
You
There
can-
there
well,
are
you-
two deployed systems. Laurel Mountain has 30 megawatts.
a few, but right.
And then Duke was talking about one.
I'd like to keep the questions rolling. Just there was in the back there,
Thanks. This is a great
and
discussion.
then
So,
over there.
two questions just for the dummies in the room like me. If you guys wouldn't mind telling us what 1,000 megawatts actually powers, average number of homes for a year or whatever it is. But my second question is this, you can probably tell I'm not from New Jersey, right? I'm from a country that you guys have already mentioned, which is Australia. And we, you've talked about the brown coal that we kind of export to China, and with 23 million people, that's not a lot, but we probably we punch above our weight in terms of emissions, right? We emit more than we should, given our population. So my question is this, what role do countries like Australia play in this discussion and in policy going forward? Is it an actual practical role day to day, or is it more, given our size, is it more an influential role? Hey, look, they're coming too.
Well, maybe just a quick comment. So 1,000 megawatts is about 200,000 homes, I think, if I've got that right. Yeah, just, a megawatt. So power is energy per time, and so it's just always delivering that kind of energy.
Right.
In terms of Australia, I think Australia and the US are some of the more energy intensive, in terms of tons of CO2 we put into the atmosphere. I think the US is 20 tons we all put into the atmosphere on average per year. I think Australia, if I remember, is somewhere around 24, a lot because of the coal. So, Australia is very important, and we had a lot of interactions with Australia in terms of carbon capture and sequestration and trying to get at, trying to mitigate some of the footprint. So very, very important.
By the way, just a quick information point. India is about 1.2 tons per person and heading up. So, so it's important to keep...
China and India. Right?
Yeah, and those are proxies for energy access, basically.
Yeah. So here's another place where I think a place like Australia or Israel, sort of developed countries that have a strong economy, can be very effective in solving, or at least in beta testing ideas. And the example I'll give is not quite energy, but it is the energy-water nexus. If you go to Israel, 80% of their water is recycled or desalinated. I mean, here it's 2%. There it's 80%. I mean, water, and that's water for drinking, agriculture, but also for energy production, which is about 40% of the use of water. The thing that's interesting about Israel is, of course, they have security needs to do this, so they're driven to spend more money. But that's an early adopter, like the military. You mentioned that the military is an early adopter. So one way to think about countries like Australia with 20 million people, or 20 plus, is, if it's possible, and these guys should speak too, is it's a place to deploy and try new ideas. The other challenge we didn't talk about is the piecemeal grid setup we have in this country. So if you talk about alternative power, you talk about trading on energy, it's a challenge, right? Because Kristina mentioned the smart grid. Places like smaller countries actually have a better shot at that kind of consistent, holistic approach.
Right.
So if you think about testing, I mean, one of the things I'm focusing on our lab on now is not looking at other countries, but looking at cities. Because cities are also nice microcosms, regional cities, to test out some of these ideas, even as simple as efficiency, right? Where you have mayors like our mayor, who's very interested, Mayor Emanuel, in trying some of these ideas out, using the data that's now coming in from the cities on use of energy, use of water, pollutants, et cetera, and using those as scaled objects that you develop the tools. A lot of them are analytical tools, by the way, and then port those over and actually export them. So small countries like, or modest-sized country like Australia is a good place to try some of these things.
And Tom's point was really important too. You know, the culture in the United States is not one thing. And if there's a support for nuclear energy and communities in the Southeast, and that serves as a laboratory, as long as there's kind of cross-communication, you can start to build more confidence in that technology in other parts of the country as well.
One other thing that's important about what he said, from an electrical design standpoint, from somebody that's in the business, put the generation near the load center. Put the generation near the people that consume.
Yeah.
Don't rely on long-haul transmissions. One of the limitations of central station renewables. That's why the important idea in the future, if you want to get to a third renewables, is distributed generation. All right?
Which natural gas can help too. In New York City, I wrote about, after Hurricane Sandy, I did a piece focused on where the lights stayed on. And there were several institutions, NYU, Co-op City, this giant set of residential buildings in the Bronx, the power stayed on because they do their own electricity generation using natural gas.
Every time.
But the problem with that one is,
Okay.
just to be clear, especially with solar and wind, those are intermittent resources. What do you do when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine?
Right.
You generally use gas
gas.
as your backup, and you're
Peaker
doubling
plants.
down your bet on natural gas.
That's right.
So
There,
natural gas
there was
actually
a
will also be
patient
a problem for
question
storage.
somewhere in that vicinity.
Yeah, there's one back there. Too.
And let's try to keep them brief so we can fit in a few more.
Thank you. I have two questions. I'm a scholar coming from Tokyo. I'm really surprised today because you talk about renewable energy and you didn't mention one time about geothermal energy, and I was really surprised about it because I understood that U.S. actually is the biggest country producing geothermal energy. So that's, I was wondering why you didn't mention about it. And the number two is, like many people in the room, I think we don't really like to pay our electricity bills. And we try actually, in the future, I think everybody would like to produce somehow their own energy from home using solar panels or, how do you say, wind energy. And, that's, I think, what we try to aim for the future. So do you take that into your future strategy?
No, I think that's what Tom was, I think that's a very good suggestion with regard to the distributed and making your own energy. And I think that's something that Tom was referring to with regard to distributed down to the individual unit size. I'll say just something about geothermal. So when I think about renewables, certainly we have what one might call the variable renewables, wind and solar. Geothermal, biomass, and hydro are more dispatchable. Geothermal is only a few percent, though, of our renewable portfolio in the U.S. right now. So I think one of the things is the challenge of finding the resource. You have to put so much investment in first, so you tie up money finding the resource, and I think that's been one of the challenges a little bit. But
We actually own a geothermal deal in Hawaii. Now, I don't get focused on geothermal because the Southeast is essentially mud and sand. There are no underground volcanoes. It's a good place to build nuclear, by the way.
But one other point about distributed power, it is very important. But if you look across the whole world, the cost of distributed power is very different.
Yeah,
and so if you look at the cost of a solar installation, several kilowatt solar installation for your home, say 10 kilowatt installation, the real expense there is not necessarily the solar panel. That's about a third of it. Most of it is what's called balance of system. And it turns out, for whatever reason, I'm not sure I understand, maybe these gentlemen do, the cost of the balance of system here in this country is about 3 times what it is in Germany. So there's a jumpstart problem here. Eventually it'll come down. Eventually we'll figure out how to make it work.
Usually the rehabs, it's an add-on system.
So that may be it,
Right.
but it's a very important component. And
A
really
huge social component to that is we've got to price appropriately the connection to the grid and the backup power source required if you have distributed generation.
Right.
Early adopters of distributed generation will likely be affluent people. If you don't price it correctly, then less affluent people subsidize more affluent
But
people,
that's the same
and
thing with
that's
electric
wrong.
cars, right? I mean,
Well,
a lot
so
of
what
things
we've
like
got to do is price it correctly, and then it's going to be good for everybody.
I might quibble with
Geothermal is big. Geothermal is big in Colorado. You can for 15,000 you can drop down below your home. A plumber can do it and get 65
that's
degree consistent water.
ground source.
Let's
heat.
go. Let's get another
Yeah,
question or two.
it's
Let's take 2
still warm
questions
water.
now, and then so they can take 2 ideas and play with them.
Yeah.
How about right here, and then who else has? Who's had your hand up really long? Stand up. Right in the front? Okay.
And that guy way in the back, too, I think he's had his hand up.
Okay, you help me.
Leon? Thank you, John Debs,
Yeah.
Colorado. I'm very disappointed in this panel. Nobody has talked about a carbon tax. All you had to do is listen to the radio this morning, NPR, 1-page bill with a rebate, so there's no net taxation. Your leaders, you got to get out in front.
Do you see that as a rational development?
Well, I like carbon tax better than I like carbon trading. I don't think carbon trading works, but
I don't like either one. I think, I really don't. I think it's a poor economic signal. There's ways to incent reduce carbon behavior. And I think we should do that rather than tax something that could be an advantage for the United States to restart the economy.
The only thing I would
Sir,
say...
excuse me?
Sorry.
The correct economic signal, I think, is approaching more like what I suggested on PRISM 2.0, clean energy standards. When we have already passed, I think everybody's high focused on carbon given President Obama's speech the other day. EPA has already passed some land-breaking regulations that have changed the face of generation in America. And for example, my company has already reduced our carbon footprint 27%. That is some 10% higher than Waxman-Markey would have required. That's not completely true. That has changed the energy mix, but it has not changed the capacity mix. And what we should do is incent, I think, low-carbon alternatives as the fleet changes over time. That's a better way for the economy, in my view.
Well, one other question, one other reality on carbon taxation is look at how successful we were with all the other efforts in the grand bargain to rejigger our economic system. Congress is not in any way going to get near that, even as a revenue neutral thing. I just don't see.
But the only...
That's true.
The only
They
thing
said it about same-sex marriage too.
Don't forget the 48% of the people that make less than $40,000 a year. Their consumption of energy is relatively inflexible. They want lights, they want to be warm in the winter and cool in the summer. It is a regressive tax. It's not a good idea in my view.
The only thing I'd say, two things about that, and it's a question maybe for you, but in response to this, go back to sulfur dioxide, right? And that was that created a market. It was cap and trade to clean up sulfur dioxide, and that was an incredibly effective market. So the question is, why not now for carbon? The second point I wanted to make, and then you can speak, is that there are markets being created in China and Europe, the same kind of market that we created. Guys like Richard Sandor created around sulfur dioxide. They're trying to create a carbon dioxide. China's doing it, and so is Europe. So why not U.S.?
Well, China's doing it because of the pollution imperative, not because of the climate imperative. Yeah. They're dying. Their citizens dying by the thousands because of conventional coal-based pollution.
Fair enough.
Right here.
Have I got it? Am I on the air?
You're on there.
Great panel.
And
my question has to do with, my question is about Keystone. As far as I know, we pump between 80 and 100 million barrels a day. Keystone is going to do about 1 million barrels, which is what 1.5% of what we do in the world. The State Department says it's 17% or so dirtier than regular oil. Now we're talking about 1/5 to 1.5%. My question to the panel is, why all that wind and energy being spent on that issue when it is only a rounding error?
That's a cultural, not a technological
We need a White House representative here.
Hey, look, in general, we should develop America's energy resources. That's my view.
Yeah.
It's
a different country.
And it's the difference between...
Just checking.
Yeah, but what's going to happen is if we don't build the pipeline, they'll export it somewhere else.
First of all, there's a little fact check. We already import oil sands. We already import oil sands into Denver, into Indiana, and Ohio. This is a different pipeline too also. So there's a lot of thought out there, this is a new thing. It's not. It's already being done.
And the focus on Keystone is a political choice by activists who see that as a way forward, and they know the basics. As long as oil is roughly $100 a barrel, we're going to buy it, drill it from the ends of the earth in really dirty, ugly places, whether it's Canada or Nigeria or Venezuela or the Arctic. The high price is what drives
I'm just going to say one thing. When you're done.
Well, I just want to be sure we fit in.
Okay.
We have 3 more minutes. So.
All right. No, the only comment I was going to make, and I think going back to the gas tax issues, I'd prefer that we fuel switch from gasoline to electricity as soon as possible. Because if you look at what electric vehicles can do, whether it's a hybrid and I'm glad that we increased the CAFE standards, you're talking about going back to the times of less than $1 for equivalent gasoline. Gallon of gasoline, if it's electrical. In that case, then it's cheaper for folks making less than $40,000 a year, and I think that's where we really need to go.
If we can get to electric vehicles at cost, we've done the systems at Argonne, we've done the systems level analysis. If you can really go to full electric light truck and automobiles, you've cut carbon production by 1/3. And that's a huge number.
That is a
there's
big
an
number.
analog to your
Because a third of that is
Not,
already.
not if you burn coal to make electricity.
Well,
There's
no,
a-
no.
right, but it's
Okay,
still about
You're absolutely
50%.
right.
Well,
on
that's
the
where
current
the
mix.
third, a third, a
This is the
third,
current
and we
mix.
looked at
But
that.
actually, you guys are going to make that mix
burn
better.
more gas,
So
yeah.
actually, the argument is if you go to China and put electric vehicles in, it's a really bad thing.
Broadly speaking,
Yeah, no, that's right,
electricity is
because it's
50% of the
coal.
carbon of oil.
Right.
There's another analog to your important question. So there's Keystone. But when we think about the 5 points on natural gas, to be cautious, we're going to have to build a new infrastructure to access these new gas finds. So you're going to have those issues reoccurring over and over again in the future.
In a country that is as prone to what's called banana, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything.
There you go.
So that's,
my
you know, the
backyard.
politics and the cultural issues. Yeah, and Tom Friedman got that from someone else too. So
very
it kind of, but it's true. I think what I want to do is, because we won't get to all the questions, email me, revkin@nytimes.com if your question was not addressed, or on Twitter @revkin.
Can't we get another half
And
hour?
we'll get one more question, maybe right in the back there. Keep it really brief, and then each of you can use this as a summary moment as well.
Okay.
And try to make it brief.
I'll be really brief. I just want to ask you about the capital costs in building nuclear, how you're addressing that in terms of bringing that down without, while keeping it safe.
Oh, absolutely. Those are two different questions. But the nuclear cost right now is about $4,500, somewhere around there. Yeah, per kW. And it's about energy is going to be about the equivalent on natural gas, about $1 per million BTU. So it's high capital cost, cheap energy. The blessing of what we've been able to do in Georgia so far, when we committed to that project, $14 billion, 10 years to build it, we own 45.7% of it. What's fascinating is we thought that would produce about a 12% price increase to Georgia Power's customers. Right now, we believe that price increase is only going to be between 6 and 8%. That's pretty good. Yes, we have moved the schedule. Yes, costs have gone up, but the benefits have overwhelmed the costs. So always listen for both sides of the story. This has been a great environment to build a new nuclear plant. It's going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread for America. It's going great.
It's great.
I guarantee
it's
you.
Great. It's a great an AP 1000.
So any closing thoughts here amid, we had a really rich discussion that led to lots of new questions.
Well, the mix, I think we all agreed on the ideal mix. All we disagreed on was could we get to that ideal mix.
I would like to.
So let's just go down the row here. Yeah.
So I just
Eric.
want
So in response
Or
to
is your
this-
name Steve?
Eric, you can do whatever you want to call me. Just give me 2 minutes.
Yeah, so here's-
So I'm going to go back to my friend Michael Polsky, and okay, I'll be very short. He runs a wind company, and he will tell you, you know, we think of the U.S. and everything is driven by the market, and I believe the market's very important. But he will tell you, energy is not a free market. It's just not a free market. So if we're talking about getting to this mix, it's a very difficult struggle. I think the only way to get there is in a public-private partnership mode where you do have industry leading. Certainly industry has to lead and build the big power plants. That's important. But you also need the right kind of policy in place that puts the long-term, perhaps it's a carbon regulation, but even below that, putting in the right investment in the right kinds of long-term R&D for technologies that will ultimately be able to displace and get us to the mix that we want to get to. So I think that's the critical sort of my message.
Leah, any comments?
I think the U.S. is doing a good job. A lot of great innovation going on outside of D.C., across the range, what Tom's doing and other people are doing to do good things, to put out less carbon. That's what's going to happen. We'll put out less carbon than we did before, especially per capita in this country. I think it'll come down by maybe half. Per capita is doing really well. But it could all be trumped by the fact that the population of the world is growing and you're going to use more coal around the planet. So we got to keep an eye on that.
So I just sum up, those of you that are into YouTube and all that, I gave a speech at EIA, Energy Information Administration, just a week ago Monday. So if you want more in depth about some of the stuff I've been saying, look at that speech, and I guess the text is on our website and all that stuff. Let me return to the high context, and that is the financial challenges that we face in America are some of the biggest challenges we've ever faced, and they are the most avoidable. And what we need is a national will. These are not Democrat issues, these are not Republican issues, these are essentially American issues that we all have a vested interest in. Because failing to address them leaves our grandchildren with unacceptably high interest rates and taxes. Now, you may want to reduce the cost of government and cut costs and do all that. You may want to raise taxes. I think it's a mistake. We need to reshape taxes. Said a lot about that in the public. We need to be for growth. And I think this kind of approach The energy industry in America is a way to play offense in this otherwise challenged environment, and we just got to get behind it as a nation.
I agree with that.
And Christina, last quick thought.
Definitely.
Wow, I get the last word.
If you need.
I want to follow up on something that Eric said, which is where's the leadership? And I think that it's in this room. It's each one of us has to commit to making sure our homes are energy efficient. To every mile we drive in a car, we put a pound of CO2 into the atmosphere. I mean, all these things we need to take into account and start with ourselves. And if you're running a major company and you want to see renewables go forward, then get a power purchase agreement with an independent power producer at a level that will allow them to continue to build. So if you don't have solar on your roof or on your garage, do that as well. And I would say that, you know, there are companies like Sunrun, SolarCity, Sungevity. They'll basically install for zero cost or very low cost the capital, and then they'll take a power purchase agreement with you individually for about 10% less than you're paying right now. So it's a win-win all the way around. And I think that's because we had a policy with the Recovery Act, going back to your first question you offered, which basically was a cashback grant, the 1603 cashback grant in lieu of tax credit and tax credits. And this allowed these companies to pop up and actually further the distributed solar, which put, you know, thousands of megawatts back onto our grid. So I think we all have to do our bit. And I also wanted to thank the panelists and in particular the leadership in the industry for making nuclear and other things happen.
And great. And the last thing I would say is the way we educate, the way we teach is a great opportunity and to teach that energy matters. If every kid in America had to visit the furnace room in their school and look at the budget, you know, and then understand, you know, what an air conditioner is and what a furnace is, what a boiler is, we would have better outcomes. So think about that too. It's right from the bottom, from the basic education right up through leadership in the White House. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.